man only intended to open his daughter's door to say hello after 2 years apart. But when the little girl looked up and whispered, "Daddy, it hurts," everything inside him collapsed. What kind of pain could make a soldier cry inside his own home? The bus windows rattled as it rolled over the dry dirt road on the edge of Willow Creek City. After 2 years in a combat zone, Richard Turner brought home only one thing: the memory of his daughter's eyes watching him leave. In the cabin, the driver adjusted the rearview mirror and whistled a slow, mournful tune. Richard kept his gaze fixed on the distance, where the treetops bent gently under the faded sunlight. He didn't expect anyone to be there waiting, but deep down, a small part of his heart still hoped to hear someone call his name through the dust, hoped to see a pair of small eyes waiting for him by the old garden fence. But there was no one. He stepped off the bus with a worn-out backpack, one strap slightly torn. His military boots still held traces of frozen mud. The smell of rust from the familiar iron gate drifted in the air like a memory that refused to wash away. Richard paused. The house hadn't changed. The plaster on the walls was peeling, as if no one had bothered with repairs. The hibiscus hedge was uneven, with some branches dead and brittle. He remembered painting the gate before he left. Now the paint was scratched, chipped, and faded. The entire house stood silent, like a place that had forgotten what it meant to be lived in. Richard walked up the steps and placed his hand on the doorknob. It wasn't locked, a strange detail for a man who had been to war. What's truly frightening isn't an unlocked door, but the fact that no one inside sees a reason to lock it anymore. He pushed the door gently. It creaked open, releasing the scent of aged wood and stale humidity. The living room looked just as it did the day he left, but everything seemed covered in the haze of time. A wooden clock hung crooked on the wall, the second hand still ticking, though its rhythm sounded like a groan. Richard removed his cap, placed his hand over his heart, and stepped inside slowly. His presence felt like asking permission to return to a story someone else had continued in his absence. Emily was sitting there, not the way he'd imagined. She didn't run to him. She didn't shout, "Daddy!" She just sat on the bed, her eyes wide open but not quite looking at him. She was staring in his direction, but without the trust that once lit up her face. Richard froze for a moment. He seemed afraid to disturb that posture, afraid to startle her, afraid to let the fear in her eyes spread further. He knelt down slowly, like someone learning to enter another person's world without causing pain. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice was raspy, but unforced. Emily pressed her lips together, gave a tiny nod, and buried her face into her teddy bear. Richard gently brushed aside a lock of hair from her forehead. That's when Emily whispered, "Daddy, it hurts." There was no tone of complaint in her voice, just a truth she had carried too long to wait for someone to ask about it. Richard stayed still, holding his breath. He looked at her, looked into the eyes that wouldn't meet his, then slowly rolled up the sleeve of her shirt. Bruises, scattered, blotchy, stretched across her forearm, not just one, but many. In places only someone trying to hide them would know. He didn't touch them right away. He just looked. His eyes, which had seen fallen comrades and death's cold face, turned red. "What happened here?" Richard asked. Not loud, but every word fell heavier than stone on his chest. Emily shook her head slightly, a movement so small it was almost trembling. Not in defiance, but in defense. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Calm, unhurried, not the kind of steps someone makes when they're caught doing something wrong. The sound of slippers dragging gently on the tile floor. Richard stood up and turned. It was Lorraine, the woman he had left behind 2 years ago. Her hair was tied back neatly, though a few strands had come loose. The thin striped robe clung to a figure that once was immaculate. In her right hand, she held a phone, screen still lit. Her left hand hung loosely. She stood still, lips pressed together like she was choosing her words carefully. "I didn't expect you to come back so soon," she said. The thin smile on her lips faded before it could bloom. "Emily must be happy, right?" Richard didn't answer. He stood straight, the stance of a man trained to stay composed, not to intimidate, but to resist being pulled into excuses. Lorraine shifted her gaze, her tone changing. "I was calling my mother. I didn't think today would be... Emily moved closer to Richard, still clutching her teddy bear, leaning gently into his side. Richard placed his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say another word to Lorraine. No accusations, no anger. His silence was a statement loud enough. Lorraine remained still. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter. Her face paled. Her eyes avoided the bruises on Emily's arm. Richard bent down and gently touched his daughter's shoulder. Can you show me your room, sweetheart? I want to see the things you've kept all this time. Emily didn't speak. She only nodded, barely. Richard took her hand and led her away. They walked past Lorraine. She didn't stop them, didn't say a word. Her arm hung limply at her side, her eyes following the two figures as they disappeared upstairs. Even after they were gone, Lorraine didn't move. She stood frozen like a statue whose lies had just been stripped bare in broad daylight, not because she was shocked, but because every mark on Emily's body told a story no excuse could silence. Some truths don't need evidence. Some whispers are so soft they are easy to ignore. But to a father, just one unfamiliar squeeze of his daughter's hand is enough to know it's far too late to stay silent ever again. Dad, your coat is hanging in the wrong place. The girl's voice echoed faintly from the bottom of the stairs, small as a shadow, impossible to tell if it was nervous or cheerful. Richard Turner set down his glass of water and stepped out of the room. His wool coat was draped over the back of the chair, not where his daughter was looking. He knew that, but he also knew that when a child starts saying things that aren't quite true, sometimes it's a way of checking if anyone is still listening. Lorraine hadn't come downstairs yet. The kitchen was still warm, the air faintly scented with bread and butter, like the trace of someone who had just left. Emily sat quietly at the table, her back so straight it looked strained, her hands resting flat at her sides as if she didn't know what she was allowed to touch. The spoon and fork were neatly arranged in front of her, but she stared at her plate like it was a stage where she didn't belong. Footsteps echoed from the hallway behind. Lorraine appeared with 2 plates of food. Her breathing was calm and her steps light, but the rush in her eyes betrayed her. She placed 1 plate in front of Richard and spoke through a thin smile, like frost on a window pane. I overslept a little, but luckily everything was still warm. Richard didn't answer right away. He gave a slight nod, eyes fixed on Emily. When he did speak, his voice dropped like a string held too long on a guitar. At the very least, you should make sure Emily eats on time. He turned to his daughter, placing his hand gently on the table. How's breakfast, sweetheart? If you'd like something different, I can try making it another way next time. Emily glanced up for a moment, her eyes unreadable except for the cautious look of someone weighing whether they were allowed to be honest. Then she looked down again, her hair falling to hide half her face. The air around the dining table seemed to compress. No clinking silverware, no whisper of wind through the windows. Richard sat only an arm's length from his daughter, but the space between them felt like the far side of a moat he had no bridge to cross. Her eyes, in that fleeting moment, told him everything. Some wounds don't bleed, but chill you to the bone. Lorraine poured more orange juice. Her voice was soft, like a lullaby, but each word seemed carefully measured to soothe and slice at the same time. She's a good girl, just not as sharp as other kids. I've been teaching her how to behave properly. Out there, no one has patience for children who talk back. Richard stayed silent, eyes never leaving Emily. He watched every small movement, how she nudged her chair just slightly to avoid making noise, how her fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth like it was the only thing anchoring her to the room. In her expression, there was no rebellion, no defiance, only the quiet anxiety of a child who had learned to swallow tears, a silence no one teaches, but one that never leaves. Since returning, Richard had noticed how certain things in the house no longer belonged to him. The old sofa he used to lie on with the newspaper was now covered with a white sheet. The wedding photo had been replaced with a lifeless still life. But strangest of all were his daughter's eyes, once full of chatter and curiosity, chasing light across window panes. Now quiet as a drained well, in the old bedroom, midday light slipped through the sheer curtains. Richard opened the wardrobe and refolded his worn military uniforms. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the fabric. Under the bed, His hand brushed against something hard and dusty. He pulled out a child's shoe, worn at the heel, one lace completely broken, a faded brown stain near the back, long dried. He didn't say a word. He carried it to the backyard and placed it on the wooden shelf beside the wash basin, under the small cactus Lorraine had planted when she moved in. The shelf trembled slightly as he pulled his hand away. Richard stared at the shoe for a long while, as if it had once been capable of speech and was still deciding whether to speak again. When Emily left for school, Richard quietly opened her desk drawer. Inside were only pencils, an unused notebook, and a few folded scraps of paper. He opened one. Pencil sketches, faces without mouths, lines blurred and faint. One drawing alone had a red streak across the cheek. He folded them back, gently, like handling a living scar. That afternoon, Emily was drawing. She sat alone at the dining table, her head low over the paper. Richard approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he stopped behind her, the drawing was still unfinished. A child stood in the middle of the yard, the sky above drawn in gray crosshatches. No umbrella, no adults, just water dripping down the edge of the paper. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Emily jumped and quickly covered the page. "Nothing, just rain." "Are you afraid of the rain?" She didn't answer. She gathered her colored paper and stuffed it into her jacket pocket. But as she turned away, he saw it. A blue ink stain had bled into the shape of a teardrop, as if someone had once cried onto the page. That night, Lorraine went to bed early, claiming a headache. Richard stayed in the kitchen, alone with the ticking of the clock and a neighbor's dog barking at nothing. On the table, he opened an old photo album, turning through pages filled with images of his wife and daughter when they were younger. In the photos, Emily's eyes had once sparkled like newborn glass. Now they were two slabs of metal welded shut. Soft footsteps brushed across the carpet. Richard looked up. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Emily sat just outside, hugging her pillow, her hair messy, her eyes unblinking. "You can't sleep?" She shook her head gently. She didn't step closer, didn't retreat either, just stared at him, as if trying to see whether that face still resembled the man she used to call Dad. Richard stood, walked over without rush. He sat beside her on the floor, silent for longer than any question required. Then he spoke, quietly. "You know, I've never used my voice to scare anyone. Never." Emily tilted her head, her gaze steady. Slowly, she leaned into his shoulder, lightly as if afraid she might break. Outside, the wind had stopped, but the wind chime still swayed gently, like someone was brushing against it with a cold palm. Richard placed his hand on her head. He said nothing more. A child doesn't flinch like that unless someone taught them to, and a father, if he once risked his life to defend a country, then what he must defend now, more than anything, is the gaze of a daughter that's been quietly suffocated. Outside Lincoln Elementary School, the wind swept through the bare jacaranda branches, carrying the scent of dust and the soft rustle of late-season leaves. Children in light blue uniforms lined up to enter the building, backpacks slung over their shoulders, mouths still mumbling stories left unfinished from the last recess. Richard Turner stood at a distance, not close enough for anyone to see his face clearly, but near enough to observe every detail of a world he once believed would be safe for his daughter. He hadn't been here since the day Emily started first grade. For 2 years, the battlefield, the barracks, and nightly reports of casualties at the border had consumed his mind. But now, standing in the quiet courtyard that felt like a fairground after the crowd had left, he wasn't thinking of bullets or marching orders. He was thinking of her eyes, always lowered, never once meeting his since he'd returned. Richard entered the schoolyard in the strange stillness of a morning that held no warning. The security guard at the gate nodded with just enough movement, his eyes not distracted, but seeming to say, "Soldiers returning home don't always bring good news." The hallway ahead was dappled with early light. The classroom doors stood ajar, like mouths about to speak but holding back, revealing inside rows of neatly aligned desks, waiting like child-sized formations. The air carried a mix of old paper, ink, and the lingering lime from the last winter's renovations. A man in a wrinkled shirt, holding a stack of graded papers, turned the corner. Richard hesitated, then stepped forward. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Thomas Grant?" The man paused, looked at him for a moment as if searching for a long-forgotten face. Then he nodded. "Yes, I'm Thomas, and you are—" "Richard Turner, Emily's father." Mr. Grant tightened his grip on the stack of papers, a reflex born from answering difficult questions. He gestured toward a long bench tucked behind a scattering of fallen bougainvillea petals, where sunlight filtered through the leaves. They sat. The space between them wasn't far, but neither rushed to speak. Richard looked down, watching a purple petal settle on the dusty toe of his boot, then spoke quietly. "She seems different at home. I want to know how she is in class." Thomas sighed, his eyes fixed on the playground where a few kids were chasing one another in circles. "Emily's a diligent student, quiet. She never causes trouble, never comes in late, never complains, but she also doesn't laugh, doesn't make friends, and she doesn't raise her hand anymore." Richard remained silent, his eyes drifting toward the rusting tin roof above Emily's classroom. "I don't know what's happening at home," Thomas continued, his voice lowering, "but when I stand near her, she flinches, like it's ingrained in her bones. She's not afraid of teachers, she's afraid of people." A distant bell rang, signaling recess. Neither of them moved. Richard asked, his voice firmer now, "Has anyone ever said anything about Lorraine? About how she treats Emily?" Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "In this town, if you don't have hard proof, people stay silent. And Lorraine Campbell, I have to say, she always showed up to parent-teacher meetings on time, spoke politely, always said Emily was well-behaved." Richard rose, thanked him, and quietly walked away. His boots tapped softly on the old cement hallway, each step striking like a knock on the door of memory. At the grocery store near the town square, the shopkeeper was wiping down shelves, the smell of soap mingling with flour and the faint sweetness of fresh bread. "Richard? Goodness, how long has it been since we saw you around?" The elderly woman nodded, eyes sharp despite her age. Richard smiled lightly, placing a hand on the counter. "Just visiting home, and my daughter. She's a sweet kid, that one, but since she moved in with Lorraine, she's barely spoken a word. Folks say it's because Lorraine raised her well, so polite, so tidy, like a girl from a good family." Richard hesitated. He glanced around the store, then asked gently, "Has anyone ever said anything about Lorraine?" The old woman paused her wiping, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Some say a woman who lives too precisely tends to keep the neighbors at a distance. But Lorraine's different. No one's ever seen her start trouble, never heard her raise her voice. And kids, well, each one's got their own temperament. Some are bubbly, some keep to themselves. You can't always tell what they're hiding inside." He nodded as a farewell, then picked out a few packs of cookies, an excuse to leave without needing to say more. As he stepped out into the slanting afternoon sun, something inside him cracked a little, like a thin fracture in old glass that at first seems harmless but slowly warps the whole reflection. On the way home, he passed a row of older houses near the church. A woman tending her garden stopped when she saw him. "Richard, back again? You've lost weight since last time. Mrs. Helen Whitaker, ma'am. Good to see you. Do you remember the little girl who stayed at my house before Emily?" She nodded, her eyes dimming. "Sophie? Yeah, that girl didn't talk much either, just like Emily now. One morning, I saw her little backpack tossed beside the trash bin, zipper wide open, nothing left inside. No one asked about her, no one mentioned her. It was like someone erased her overnight." Richard wanted to ask more, but she turned and went inside, closing the door. When he got home, Richard stepped into the kitchen and found Emily on her knees scrubbing the floor with an old rag. Her hands were soapy, her elbows red, a long scratch running along her wrist. Lorraine stood at the fridge, holding a water pitcher like nothing was unusual. She glanced at Emily out of the corner of her eye, then said casually, like she was recounting a normal event, "She spilled milk all over the floor, so I let her clean it herself. She has to learn that if you make a mess, you clean it up." Richard stared at Emily for a long while. Her small figure was curled over the tile like a shadow, silent and worn. Her tiny fingers kept circling the same wet patch, as if wiping away the milk might somehow earn her forgiveness. He stepped forward, knelt beside her, and gently placed his hand over hers. Not forceful, just enough to stop her. Without a word, Emily looked up at him. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second, then pulled away. Richard took the cloth from her hand, folded it, and set it aside like he was putting something far heavier to rest. That night, just as Richard was hanging up his coat, he heard a faint rustling. A brown envelope had been slid through the door. He opened it. The writing inside was messy, unsigned. "She's not the first." Richard stood frozen, the paper clenched in his hand. His eyes didn't blink, as if closing them would bring up a vision too painful to bear. Outside, the night moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside him, something had awakened, and this time, he wouldn't let anyone sweep it away like an anonymous breeze again. The kitchen that day looked no different from any other, but the smell of bleach was sharp in the air, cutting through every fold of memory that Richard Turner had tried to avoid. Sunlight streamed through the sliding glass door, casting light over Emily's small hands as she wrung out a white towel in a metal basin. She wasn't using the washing machine. It sat idle in the corner, spotless and shiny, but as if it were reserved for adults only. Richard leaned against the doorframe, loosely holding a half-empty glass of cold water, eyes fixed on the little girl, trying to squeeze the last bit of water from the cloth. Red marks lined Emily's hands from the soap soaking into her young skin. Each movement grew slower, as if even the weight of the light through the window was pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't turn around, but Richard could see her holding her breath, as if exhaling might cause the whole moment to shatter. He didn't need her to say anything. Her silence was loud enough. "You could use the washing machine," he said softly. Emily froze, her hands still on the towel. A brief hesitation. Then she shook her head ever so slightly. She said, "My hands are dirty. I'm not allowed to touch anything electric." Richard didn't answer. He stepped into the kitchen, opened a cabinet to get another glass of water, but his eyes never left her. He sat down, looking out into the backyard, where Lorraine Campbell was tending the rose bushes. She wore thin leather gloves, her hair pinned up, a crisp white dress that gleamed in the sun. To the neighbors, she was the perfect wife. You come back from war thinking you've toughened up, but maybe the place that wounds you most is your own home. That thought flickered through Richard's mind like a quiet exhale. He set the glass down and moved toward the bottom kitchen drawer, pretending to look for scissors, the second one from the left. He had seen Lorraine put something there once, just by chance. He opened it carefully. Among spice packets and paper napkins was a long object wrapped in brown paper, wedged crookedly to one side. Richard pulled it out. It was an old wooden ruler, one end crusted with what looked like dried reddish-brown stains. He stood up straight, fingers tightening around it. Lorraine had just entered the house, didn't notice right away, but then her eyes caught the object in his hand. "Why are you going through my things?" Richard met her gaze. "What is this?" She gave a soft laugh, like he had asked something ridiculous. "You're overreacting. It's a measuring stick. I use it for fabric." Richard tilted his head slightly, his voice even, like calm ground after a storm. "What kind of fabric are you sewing that needs a ruler stained with dried blood?" The question wasn't loud, but it was firm, dry, and heavy. Lorraine's brow furrowed. She stepped forward and snatched the ruler from him, wrapping it again in tissue as before. "Are you surveilling me now? This is our house, Richard." He looked her in the eyes, voice low and unmoving. "Lorraine, there's no room left in this house for anything dishonest. It belongs to me and my daughter." It was the first time he said "my daughter" as a declaration, not for family conversation, as a boundary. Lorraine gave a sarcastic smile. "You think she's faultless? She's stubborn, she keeps quiet, she does what she wants." "I'm teaching her discipline," Richard answered, calm but cutting straight through the pretense. "No one has the right to punish a child in the name of love. You don't even know the difference between firm and cruel anymore. You've spent so long treating pain as something to be endured." Their voices rose, wave after wave, crashing into the walls and into Emily's chest. The girl slipped quietly away into the laundry room, squeezing herself into the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall, where the old scent of soap and damp wood still lingered. No one called her name. No one looked, but a small muffled sob escaped her like instinct, as if even silence could be overheard if she wasn't careful enough. And Richard didn't hear the sound, but it was the strange stillness of the house that made him turn around. He walked around the kitchen and opened the cabinet. The little girl was curled up in the corner, wide-eyed, clutching a pillow. Her tears hadn't yet fallen, but her eyes were red. Richard knelt down and held out a hand, gently, with no force. Emily didn't speak. She only leaned forward slightly, as if asking permission before resting against her father's chest. Her voice was no more than a breath, barely louder than the breeze sneaking through the cracks in the door. "I'm sorry. I wasn't good. That's why I got hit." Richard tightened his arms around her shoulders. The same hands that once gripped rifles and built tents in frozen forests now trembled, unsure of whether to hold her tightly or carefully. He closed his eyes. The smell of her hair mixed with the sharp tang of bleach. A truth hit him hard in the chest. Children don't need to be perfect to deserve love, and they never deserve to be hurt for the mistakes of grown-ups. Lorraine stood frozen at the doorway, her arms loosely cradling the object wrapped in tissue, as if letting go would make everything collapse. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on the father and daughter on the floor without blinking. There was no smugness left in her gaze, only the stunned panic of someone who hadn't braced for the truth to crawl out of the shadows. A person can pretend to be polite to the neighbors, gentle with acquaintances, but they can't hide for long when a child flinches every time a hand is raised above the shoulder. Richard sat on the floor, holding his daughter close, his back against the cupboard. He knew the real battle was only beginning. And this time, he wouldn't lay down his weapons just because the enemy wore no uniform. Sometimes, what people forget isn't because it wasn't important, but because it made them feel so guilty, they no longer dared to speak its name. And then, when that name comes back, no one can ignore it, because it brings back a pain they thought had long been buried. The monthly market in Willow Creek City only took place once a month, for just a single day. But during that time, the entire town seemed to stir with true life. Children tugged at their mothers' hands, begging for candy. Old ladies shook out quilted towels right in the middle of the walkway. Fish vendors shouted prices from early morning until noon, and bicycle bells rang non-stop as housewives pedaled home in time to make lunch. Amid all that, Richard Turner stood still, like a lone tree casting its shadow in the middle of the square. He wandered through the stalls without any clear purpose, as if searching for a nameless memory among the calls of vendors, the clinking of aluminum pots, and the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from a pastry stand tucked behind some pots of mint. Emily had stayed home today, carefully peeling corn husks with Mrs. Martha Doyle, a meticulous task requiring gentle hands. According to her, that was the key to smooth tamale dough. Richard knew his daughter was safe. Still, a quiet sense of unease simmered in his chest, like something just beyond his vision refused to name itself. As he turned to walk down another aisle, his eyes caught a plum-colored shawl being lightly shaken out by an older woman. The motion itself was unremarkable, but the way her hand trembled and how her eyes darted away so quickly made his chest tighten. He froze for a moment, then slowly walked toward her. The woman turned her back as soon as she saw him looking. The gesture was clumsy, but too late. Richard followed, step by step, slow but determined. "Mrs. Martha?" She stopped in her tracks, tilting her head slightly, as if hearing a voice from an old dream. She didn't turn right away, but her grip on the basket handle tightened, an instinctive response to a memory she hadn't wanted to touch. Richard kept his distance, letting the silence between them be wide enough for the truth to step out of hiding. In that moment, he noticed how the lines around her eyes had deepened, as though every untold story had carved a crease into her skin. "I'm sorry if this makes you uncomfortable," he said gently, "but if you know anything about Lorraine and the children who once lived with her, I need to know." Mrs. Martha turned to face him. Her eyes were dry and brittle. "Are you sure you want to hear it?" Richard didn't answer. He opened the door of the old pickup truck he'd borrowed from a friend at the repair shop and motioned for her to get in. They sat in the small, musty space, the scent of aged leather mingling with the breeze sneaking in through the cracked window. She placed her basket on the floor, smoothing her skirt like preparing for a trial. "Back when I worked at Lorraine's house," she began, "Emily wasn't there yet. But there was another child, a little girl. Her name was Sophie." Richard heard the name like a tiny crack forming in his heart, not yet clear, but hinting at something about to break free. Sophie wasn't Lorraine's daughter. She was the child of Lorraine's cousin, a woman who was dying of late-stage cancer. Before she passed, she entrusted her daughter to Lorraine, thinking she'd provide a stable, decent, God-fearing home. Richard remained silent. Mrs. Martha looked out the window, the hum of the market rising and falling like a never-ending wave. At first, everything seemed fine. Lorraine held her, took her to church, braided her hair every morning. I honestly believed she was the ideal kind of woman. But those days didn't last long. They were as brief as a prayer cut short. She paused. Her eyes moved from Richard to the empty space on the dashboard. The light from the windshield cast a pale streak across her cheek. I heard crying one night while cleaning the kitchen. Not loud, just muffled sobs coming from the bathroom. I knocked. No one answered. The next day, Sophie was wearing long sleeves in the middle of summer. Mrs. Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper. Its edges were frayed, as if it had been tucked away for years. One day, Sophie gave me this. She asked me to keep it safe if I cared about her. She didn't say anything else. Richard unfolded the paper. The handwriting was slanted, written in pencil, with some lines already smudged. If someone finds this, please know I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to be held like the other kids. He folded the note back up very slowly, as if afraid it might tear even further. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. What happened to Sophie after that? Mrs. Martha shook her head. Lorraine said the girl had a fever, so she sent her to a hospital in Durango. No one ever saw her again. They said she'd been transferred. Then, nothing. I asked once and she fired me, told me I had no right to interfere in family matters. Richard didn't ask more. Mrs. Martha lowered her gaze. I should have done something, but I stayed silent, just like everyone else. She opened the truck door and stepped out before Richard could say anything. Before leaving, she added in a quiet voice, Emily is lucky to have you. Don't let her become the next name people try to forget. The house was quiet when Richard got home. Emily had fallen asleep at the kitchen table. In her arms was the old teddy bear, missing one eye, with a worn ear and dusty fur, but still hugged like treasure. Richard walked over quietly, gently laid a blanket over her shoulders, and paused at the window. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains. Outside, an unfamiliar car was parked by the fence. Lorraine stood beside it, speaking to a man he didn't recognize. The man didn't get out. He just leaned back in the driver's seat, smoking, thick plumes of smoke rising around him. Lorraine lowered her head, pointed toward the house, then glanced up at the window where Richard stood. He didn't hide. He stood tall, his eyes unblinking. Lorraine caught his gaze for a brief moment, then turned quickly away. Richard looked back at his sleeping daughter, pulled the blanket a little higher over her shoulders, and in his mind, the name Sophie echoed again. No one spoke of her. No one looked for her. No one mourned her. But from this day forward, Sophie would no longer be a forgotten name. On the old wooden table, scarred like a map of time, Richard Turner carefully placed the letter under the flickering glow of the oil lamp. The blue ink trembled across the thin paper, smudged in the first few lines as if the writer's hand had failed to stay steady. He didn't know who had written it until he reached the end. There was no name, only a blank space. But in his heart, one name rang out clearly. Sophie. Emily was sound asleep, her breathing slow and even from the small wooden bed in the corner. The flames from the stove flickered against the curtain, casting soft amber strokes on Richard's face like the last light of a dying sunset. He read slowly, one sentence at a time. If someone is still listening, I just want to be believed. Once I dropped a bowl, and she made me stand outside until the rooster crowed. No coat. I'm sorry for dirtying the floor. I'm sorry for crying too loud. I'm sorry for existing without being loved. I didn't dare write my name, but if the one reading this is kind, then I hope you believe me. Richard tightened the paper in his hand, not from anger, but as if trying to hold on to something fragile slipping away. In war, he had seen eyes like that, silent, unblinking, as if words had become a luxury too expensive in the presence of pain. When he finished the last line, he sat still in the fading firelight, his eyes tracing the dark corners of the wooden wall where no pictures hung. Finally, he stood up, pulled on his worn military jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. Outside, the wind slid down from the hills, carrying with it the scent of earth and wild grass after a damp spell. He stood motionless for a long time, not imagining what lay ahead, nor preparing for what was behind. Only one quiet truth cracked open inside him. It has to end. Someone has to break the cycle everyone keeps calling normal. Old folks in his hometown used to say, a tree doesn't fall because of the wind, but because its roots have rotted for too long. He didn't want Emily to grow up like a tree hollowed out at its base. When he returned to the room, he pulled the blanket up over his daughter, then sat on the edge of her bed, watching her eyelids flutter slightly. Tomorrow we leave. No one will make you afraid ever again, I promise. The quiet drag of the suitcase wheels echoed through the empty house, the floor humming like an over-tightened violin string. Emily stood by the corner of the table, her eyes following the canvas bag as she slowly packed each item. No words were spoken, no questions asked. Only a strange, focused patience in her small hands, folding her worn stuffed bear, like everything had been planned a long time ago in her heart. Richard packed quickly. There wasn't much that mattered, but he still checked each old book, each shirt, as if the act itself helped preserve parts of memory not yet dust-covered. Lorraine appeared in the doorway just as the sun tipped over the far side of the porch roof. Her dress was perfectly pressed, and her voice was sweet enough to keep suspicion at bay. "What are you doing?" Richard didn't turn around. He zipped the bag and stood up straight. "We're leaving." Lorraine still smiled, but the edge of her mouth twitched slightly. "Leaving? Now? I think we need to talk. Emily needs stability." He looked at her. Not angry, not bitter, just enough to stop anyone from smiling again. She needs to live, not just exist. Lorraine stepped closer, her foot barely making a sound as it touched the floor, as if afraid to disturb the air. "You're blaming me for things you haven't even seen. Kids are sensitive, Richard. You can't believe everything they say." Richard interrupted. "I don't believe words. I believe bruises. I believe eyes. I believe the things she never dared to tell." Lorraine had no reply. In the pale golden light coming through the curtain, her face showed a kind of confusion she could no longer hide behind makeup. Richard slung the bag over his shoulder and bent down to take Emily's hand. The girl looked up at him, then glanced back at the woman standing frozen. Emily didn't say goodbye. She didn't speak. She just held her father's hand tighter. The door opened, the wind swept in, and the two of them left the house they once called home without looking back. Lorraine remained frozen in the doorway, like a porcelain statue left in the wrong place. Her blinking was erratic, struggling to hold on to composure, but her fingers were already clenching the fabric at her waist. Her legs, no longer obeying, slowly gave way beneath her, as if the entire house were collapsing around her and no one noticed. On the road out of town, Richard's truck moved slower than usual, not from fear, but out of respect, for the final stretch before beginning somewhere new. Emily leaned her head against the window, clutching her teddy bear, her lips pressed tight, as if holding back tears. Richard didn't urge her to speak. He simply placed his hand over hers, just enough to feel that she was still there, staying strong in her own way. In his coat pocket was the letter, light as a leaf, but heavy as a memory no one wanted to recall. It wasn't just Sophie's letter. It was the voice of every child who'd never been heard. As the truck turned down the winding road leading to the foot of the hills, the sunlight streamed in at an angle, casting a soft orange glow over their hands, gentle as a wound beginning to heal. Richard thought, maybe not everyone is brave enough to start over, but fathers don't get to choose. He hadn't said it to reassure her. He said it to make sure he believed it himself. And this time, his words wouldn't just disappear into the wind. A forest bird called from somewhere high among the sun-bleached branches, its voice drifting in like a memory carried from far away, quiet, patient. The wind brushed across the old tin roof, sending a few dry leaves rustling down onto the porch of the modest wooden cabin. In the stillness of nature, something else was beginning to stir. Peace. Not because nothing had ever happened here, but because everything had once hurt. And now, this place was learning how to breathe again. Richard Turner stood on the front step, his eyes following the early morning light filtering between the ridges of the hills. The ground beneath his boots still carried the scent of last season's scorched grass, mingled with pine and rotting wood. This cabin once belonged to his parents, the place where he grew up through hard winters and dinners eaten by lantern light. In his youth, he had sworn never to return. This place, to him, meant poverty and burden. But today, with a worn-out backpack and a little girl asleep inside, he knew he had made the right choice by coming back. The faint squeak of rope sliding against a metal hook sounded from the corner of the yard, pulling Richard's attention. The old swing still hung beneath the tamarind tree, its wooden seat worn smooth by time, built years ago by his mother from unfinished pine. The wood had grayed with age, now coated in a fine layer of moss, like new skin covering an old scar. It swayed gently, even though the wind had quieted, as if memory itself had come alive, reaching softly toward the heart of the man standing there. Inside the house, Emily was crouched on the floor, tugging dust-covered rugs from beneath the furniture. Her face no longer showed fear, only quiet focus. She looked up and asked, her voice small, "Daddy, how long are we staying here?" Richard knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "As long as we need to, until you feel safe enough not to flinch when someone says your name." Emily didn't reply. She only lowered her head and rubbed at her wrist. The bruises had faded, but the instinct to hide them hadn't. Richard didn't blame her. He understood. Some pain doesn't disappear with time. You just learn how to live with it a little more gently. After lunch, Emily wandered to the backyard with a small notebook in her hands. Richard stayed behind in the kitchen, wiping down the old table. From the phone resting on the wooden shelf, he quietly dialed a familiar number. The screen lit up with the name, Sheriff Walter Green. "Hello? It's Richard. I'm at the old cabin down by the South Hills. I figure you still remember it. How are you and your girl holding up?" The sheriff's voice came low and steady, as if he too was looking toward the hills at that very moment. Richard spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Last night, she slept straight through. No flinching, no crying, just slept." There was a pause on the other end, and when the sheriff spoke again, his voice had dropped. "I'm glad, but I know you well enough to guess that's not all you're after." Richard took a breath. "I received Lucia's letter. Mrs. Doyle brought it to me directly. I've got pictures, records, witness testimony, but I'm not calling to file a report. I'm calling to say this: silence won't be the end of it." There was a rustle of papers over the line, then Sheriff Green's voice came back, slow and heavy. "I've been trying to convene the town council, but Richard, you know as well as I do. If you want the truth to come out, you'll have to be the one to say it. No one else will speak for you." Richard nodded, though the sheriff couldn't see him. "I'm not hiding. I just needed to bring my daughter somewhere where fear couldn't speak louder than her voice. But now, it's time to go back. I have to protect the next child who might be living through what my daughter did." The call ended in a mutual silence. Richard set the phone down, his eyes never leaving the window facing the woods. He knew that in a few days, nothing would be the same again, but that was the price he had to pay. Outside, Emily was sitting beneath a tamarind tree, her fingers gently brushing the petals of wildflowers. She reached out to touch the back of a small bobcat that had crept from the underbrush. The animal startled and disappeared into the foliage, and Emily giggled, a soft sound, but enough to make Richard pause. It had been so long since he'd heard that sound from his daughter. As the last rays of daylight stretched across the wooden floor, Emily slowly opened the front door and stepped inside. In her hand was a folded sheet of paper, its edges worn from being handled repeatedly. She approached Richard with a quiet, steady walk, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. She held out the envelope. "I finished it, but please, don't open it. It's for Mom. I'll read it when we go back to town." Richard took the letter without a word and gave her a slight nod. He understood. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. The fact that Emily had written it, that she had chosen to hold on to her emotions and give them form, meant more than any apology ever could. The evening sky had turned a soft ash gray. Small glimmers of light flickered along the horizon, like tiny seeds of hope. Richard stood with his daughter on the porch, his hand gently closing around hers, firm yet tender. We're going back to Willow Creek. But this time, you won't have to be afraid of anyone." Emily nodded without asking why, because in her father's eyes, she had already seen every reason she needed. Somewhere in Willow Creek City, there were still people pretending that the truth didn't exist. But silence doesn't last forever. Just like winter cannot hold back the bloom of flowers, light will eventually find its way through, and the two of them were getting ready to be the ones who would bring that light, not with rage, but with truth. The air inside St. James Church that day didn't carry the usual scent of incense from a Sunday service. Instead, it held the dry smell of sun-scorched wood and dust carried in from the town square. Everything stood still, as if waiting for something unfamiliar, something that wasn't listed in the liturgical calendar, something the parish hadn't prepared for. The stained glass windows cast colored rays across the long pews, shadows falling like fragmented memories. The first to enter wasn't Pastor James Carter, nor the church usher, but Sheriff Walter Green. He wore an old button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, dusty cowboy boots, and a gaze that no longer wandered. He wasn't armed, only carrying a folder tucked beneath his arm. As he stepped into the center aisle, silence swept across the sanctuary. There were no bells, no hymns, but his presence alone stretched the atmosphere taut, as if something was about to break. Emily Turner entered from the back, her old canvas shoes making soft, even shuffling sounds. She clutched a notebook tied with a silver ribbon. Richard Turner walked just behind her, not in uniform, no badges, just a father, his eyes worn by too many sleepless nights. Pastor Carter emerged from the eastern corridor, his dark robe brushing the tiled floor with a soft dragging sound. He gave a faint smile, but his eyes stopped first at the sheriff, then at Emily, and finally settled on Richard. "Sheriff Green," the pastor began, "this is not a courtroom, nor is it the hour for accusation." The sheriff placed the folder on the wooden podium at the center of the sanctuary. "And this isn't Sunday either," he replied. "But the people of Willow Creek City are here. Today, they didn't come to hear me. They didn't come to hear you. They came to hear a child. And I'm here to make sure no one turns away again." Emily was invited forward. No one guided her, no one held her hand. Yet she didn't hesitate. She walked slowly, steadily, as if each step carried a question she hoped someone would finally answer. At the podium, she didn't glance at the crowd. She opened her notebook and turned to a carefully folded page. Her voice was small, but it carried. "There were times I was punished for asking why. I didn't understand. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't as bad as they said I was." All eyes turned to her. No one interrupted, no one whispered. Even the children who usually fidgeted stayed still. Light from the window struck her long black hair, casting a faint halo around her, as if something unseen was guarding her now. She continued reading. "One day, I spilled a glass of milk on the carpet. I was made to sit outside until nightfall. It was cold, but I didn't dare call out. I was afraid it would lead to more punishment. I just sat there, hoping my stepmother would forget I existed." Richard quietly clasped his hands together. Sheriff Green bowed his head, and the entire church descended into a silence that needed no words. Emily lifted her eyes. "I'm not here to accuse anyone, but I want people to know that there was a time I said I was hurting, and no one asked where. No one asked why I flinched when someone touched my shoulder. Everyone just said, 'Get used to it, you'll be fine.'" Lorraine Campbell stood at the back of the church. Her face had gone pale, one hand clutching her purse strap. Her once perfectly curled hair now hung limp at her cheeks. She tried not to lower her head, but her eyes couldn't help but avoid the truth. Emily produced a letter that Sophie Blake had sent from the Monterey Rehabilitation Center. She didn't read the entire thing, just pointed to a passage written in shaky blue ink. "If someone out there is still listening, please believe me. I wasn't the first to be hurt, and I don't want to be the last to be forgotten." Then she pulled out a notebook once kept by Mrs. Martha Doyle. It contained handwritten notes by Lorraine, outlining gentle discipline methods designed to teach children how to be silent. Emily didn't explain. She simply placed the notebook next to the letter on the podium. I don't have the kind of proof grown-ups usually want, but if what I'm saying is true, then today is the day adults should listen. She stepped down. No one clapped, but something shifted in the air quietly, irreversibly. An elderly woman in the front row, dressed in black with white lace trim, stood up with the help of her cane. Her movements were slow, as if even she hadn't expected to rise. Then another woman stood. Then a young man, likely the delivery boy from Lorraine's shop, straightened his back, both hands gripping his baseball cap. No one spoke. But their silence was not denial. It was acknowledgement, an unspoken apology, a collective bowing of heads from those who had once looked away. Richard bowed his head. Emily stood close beside him, her hand wrapped around his finger. Sheriff Green stepped up a stair, facing the congregation. I once turned away. I once believed in appearances. But today, I believe in a child. And if this town still dares to call itself a community of decency, then decency must begin with listening. From the back, Lorraine took a step backward as if preparing to leave, but the sheriff turned toward her. You won't walk away this time. Not anymore. She didn't reply, but her knees trembled, the heels of her shoes slipping slightly on the floor, making a sound like a whispered confession. Pastor Carter stood still beside the altar, no longer looking at her. His posture didn't change, but his eyes were lost, no longer the eyes of a man in control. Sheriff Green opened the church doors. He said nothing. The wind from the square swept in, carrying the distant chirping of birds and the scent of sun after rain. Emily stepped out first. The sunlight hit her eyes and she squinted, but she didn't shield her face. She stood there, inhaling deeply, as if it was the first breath she had ever truly taken. Richard followed, not holding her hand anymore. She didn't need him to lead. Emily had stepped into the light in her own way. And up above, from the roof of the church, a flock of sparrows, birds that had always avoided the ringing bell, now circled overhead, as if to mark that something had truly changed in the heart of Willow Creek City. Boom, boom, the thunder rumbled in the distance, but no one flinched. And yet, something in the air inside the church had shifted. The tension was no longer sharp like an arrow, but rather a smoldering weight, like warm ashes refusing to go cold. No one spoke when Lorraine was handcuffed. No one cried. No one clapped. All eyes turned to Emily, but she didn't retreat. The girl stood upright, her fingers clutching the edge of her shirt, as if the lightest breeze might knock her down, yet she didn't fall. Sheriff Walter Green unfolded an official document, his eyes sweeping across the crowd before speaking in a clear, steady voice. The Willow Creek City Council hereby issues a detainment order for Mrs. Lorraine Campbell to investigate allegations of physical and emotional abuse against a minor. For a brief moment, murmurs threatened to swell, but no one dared to speak. Only the heavy footsteps of the deputy echoed forward, followed by the metallic click of handcuffs against the old wooden pews. Lorraine did not resist, did not scream. Her face turned ghostly pale, not from guilt, but from something she'd never faced before: loss of control. The only person to step forward was Pastor James Carter. He left the pulpit like a man who had just been dethroned, his voice still trying to carry the tone of moral authority. We are forsaking what is sacred by placing judgment in the hands of a child too young to know right from wrong. Richard, you're not protecting your daughter. You're betraying the Almighty. Richard didn't respond, but Mrs. Martha Doyle, who had been sitting quietly near the back, stepped forward. She didn't look at the pastor. She looked straight at Emily. Her voice was slow and rough from age. It's not the one who speaks the truth that betrays God. It's the one who stays silent, knowing the truth. Pastor Carter froze, his eyes shifting as if searching for a familiar face to cling to among the growing sea of disappointment. A few women bowed their heads in shame. Several men looked away. The atmosphere turned thick, not with anger, but with silent guilt. No one had the courage anymore to defend what had long been hidden behind closed doors. Emily kept her gaze steady, following Lorraine's steps as she was led away. She didn't speak, didn't grimace, didn't shed a tear. She simply tilted her head slightly, a quiet, deliberate motion that said, "I saw everything, and I stayed." Not out of revenge, not out of pity, but from the calm resilience of someone who no longer hides. Lorraine lowered her head as she stepped down from the altar. One hand shielded her eyes from the sun, the other gripped the wrist now bound in cuffs. For the first time, the town saw her small, fragile. Richard walked to the front, no paper in hand, no speech prepared. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I used to think all I had to do was protect my daughter, but I was wrong. Because if every one of us only guards one child, there will always be others left to suffer. If you saw and turned away, if you heard a child cry and shut your door, then you helped let the hurt continue, and today I will not stay silent anymore. No one clapped, but no one objected either. The silence that followed was not heavy. It felt like a shared vow. Mrs. Helen Whitaker, the elderly woman who used to sell produce at the corner market, slowly stood. She walked over to Emily, said nothing, and gently handed her a worn handkerchief with faded lace but still clean. Emily accepted it with both hands. Next came Miss Clara Del Bosque, the school kitchen staff member who once dismissed concerns with, "Emily seems fine." She didn't bow her head, but her eyes were glassy. She placed a notebook in Richard's hands, a meal attendance record that clearly showed multiple days Emily had no lunch. Not because she was sick, because she was forbidden. "I didn't know everything," she said, "but I never asked. Starting today, I'm asking." The midday light softened, as if the sky itself had lowered its voice. The old sycamore in front of the church let go of a few dry leaves. One landed softly on Emily's shoulder like a quiet punctuation mark. She looked up, her eyes no longer heavy with fear, but as if searching for a quiet corner in the world she'd finally stepped into. Sheriff Green placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, not tightly, just firmly enough to "We'll continue the investigation. But today, you did the right thing." Richard nodded, his eyes softer now, like he had just released something held back too long. He turned to Emily. She stood in the center of that quiet circle, her gaze no longer evasive, but scanning gently for something real, for a sign she wasn't alone anymore. Martha Doyle stood under the porch beam, her eyes full of tears, her hands clasped, not to pray, but in the old gesture of those who have witnessed too much silence. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying a few stray wildflower petals into the middle of the sanctuary. No one picked them up. Everyone watched each other. No one knew what would happen next, but something had definitely been set free. And then the church bell rang. 3 slow chimes. No one had planned it, but somehow, even the bell seemed to know, once the truth has been spoken, it can never be buried again. The scent of dry grass still lingered on the wooden porch, the same spot where Emily once sat with her knees drawn up, listening to her father tell the story of the clock with no hands. It was Richard's way of helping her understand that some wounds can't be measured by time. They only begin to heal when you know you're in the right place, with the right person. The small cabin at the foot of the hill had taken on a new skin. A warm earth-toned coat of paint covered the outside, and the window hinges now opened smoothly thanks to the old metal parts Richard had reforged by hand. He spent nearly 2 weeks building a pine bookshelf where Emily carefully arranged the children's books she borrowed from the regional library. Every corner of the house bore their fingerprints, from the scratch marks on the doorknobs to the faint pencil lines on the wall, all wrapped in a kind of warmth you only find in a place that truly belongs to you. Emily never once mentioned Willow Creek City again. Instead, she would sit quietly by the window table, coloring with wax crayons, as if piecing together old memories that had once been torn. In the beginning, her drawings were scattered, the shapes crooked, the colors dull, but over time they began to take form. Trees, windows with light, and a man with brown hair sitting by the fireplace. Richard never interrupted, never commented. He simply took each drawing and gently taped it to the kitchen wall using homemade glue from flour and water, as if preserving the warmth from his daughter's heart. Mrs. Martha Doyle moved into a small house just a few minutes' walk away. It had once been abandoned, but now smoke rose from its chimney every afternoon, and the smell of buttered pastries drifted all the way to the fence. Emily often rode her bike over, bringing wildflowers in exchange for a slice of cake and a hug. Mrs. Doyle never asked many questions. She would simply place a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, her gaze as soft and warm as a blanket in a slow winter. Once, Richard watched the two of them talking in the lavender garden and suddenly realized, some things adults can never explain with words, but if someone's willing to listen, children will find their own way to name what they feel. Her new school was a simple red-roofed building, small but full of light. Emily was placed in Ms. Elena's class, a teacher with curly hair and worn leather shoes from walking to school every day. On her first day, Emily kept her head down, silent. But when a tooth-gapped boy named Nico slid a note into her hand that said, "I like orange cats," she smiled for the first time in class. That afternoon, she ran home and announced, "Daddy, I wasn't scared today." Richard didn't answer right away. He tied the bundle of firewood on the porch, then turned and patted her head. "See, everyone needs one first day they didn't run from." That night, Emily drew a house and taped a small note beneath it, "A home with light at night." One hot afternoon, the mailman arrived with a pale blue envelope, slightly curled from humidity. He carefully asked for a name and had Richard sign for it. It had come from a medical facility. Richard said nothing, just walked to the backyard where the old fig tree still bore the marks from axes and blades he had once sharpened. Sitting on an old bench, he opened the letter and read the shaky handwriting from Sophie. "I miss the little one. I want to see her again, so I won't feel like I screamed into nothing." Richard handed the letter to Emily. She didn't say anything, just placed it inside her drawing box, where she kept everything that mattered. The next day, they drove toward Willow Creek City, but didn't go into the center. Instead, they stopped at the old schoolyard, where Sophie was waiting with a staff member from the center. The two girls looked at each other. No rushing hug, no bursting tears. Sophie only whispered, "I spoke up first. Now I'm not invisible anymore." Emily looked into Sophie's eyes and nodded. "Because of you, I'm not afraid." The staff member asked to take Sophie back. Before getting into the car, she pressed a small sea blue crayon into Emily's hand. Richard and Emily stayed at the schoolyard a while longer. They walked slowly along the cracked brick path where children once played tag, now a memory resting quiet. The school's nameplate above the gate had faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Emily sat on the steps and traced a swirl into the chalk-dusted ground with her fingertip. She wasn't trying to write anything, just gently letting a little sadness settle into the old stone. They didn't speak, but in that silence, a piece of the past was laid to rest, light as the breeze moving through her hair. That evening, back at the cabin, Emily hung a new drawing on the wall. It showed two girls standing side by side with a house glowing behind them. Below it, in clumsy but careful letters, she had written, "This is where my dad hears me, and people listen to the truth." Perhaps in this life, there is no phrase more heartbreaking for a father than the soft words Emily once said to Richard, "Daddy, it hurts." But more painful than physical wounds is the reality of a child being forced to learn silence, to endure suffering in the very place that should have been safest of all. This story isn't just about one brave father. It's a wake-up call for all of us, a reminder that not all wounds leave visible tears. Some scars only reveal themselves when someone is willing to look deeper and listen with their heart. Richard wasn't a hero on the battlefield. He became a hero in his daughter's life, not by wielding weapons, but through love, patience, and the belief that truth can be buried but never erased. And like all circles of justice in life, those who cause harm must face consequences, while those who stand bravely for the light will be rewarded, whether with peace of mind or the gentle smile of a child who's no longer trembling. What do you think of this father's journey? If it were you, would you be strong enough to believe in the truth, even if it meant standing alone? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this in your own life? I may be the storyteller, but I always want to hear stories from your heart. If you've made it this far, tell me how you feel. Are you okay? Are you, perhaps, carrying a silence like Emily once did? Leave your thoughts below. I read every word. And always remember, even those who have stayed silent can start speaking their truth starting today.